Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tim,
And I'm Tim.
and thank you for watching Contentment. Today we're going to be reviewing the book Galatea by Madelyn Miller. So let's jump into it. Do you want to give us some background on it?
Yeah, sure. So Galatea is a book by Madelyn Miller, but it comes from a Greek myth first. So some context about Madelyn Miller. She's a prolific author who has written a couple of books, Song of Achilles, Circe. I think she has one about Hercules. But this one focuses on the myth about this man who sees some women in his town and believes them to be a little bit, I don't know what the right word is.
Harlots.
Yeah, he sees some women and considers them to be harlots, and so he goes ahead and carves a woman out of stone, and he's like, this woman's the most beautiful woman, I wish she was alive. And in the story, Aphrodite breathes life into the stone statue, and he then marries this stone woman. And it is seen by some folks as a love story, but as Madelyn Miller does, she brings her like critical eye for literature and lets us recontextualize it and hear the voices that might not have been present in the story, or maybe imagine it as a little bit different as it has been served to us classically.
Yeah, definitely. I think, this is my first time reading Madelyn Miller, and alongside of this, I've been reading Song of Achilles as well, and sort of what I'm learning is the magic of the Madelyn Miller books is really like sort of retelling of these historic stories that have been passed down for generations and sort of a different, more modern cultural view take on things, and I think she does an excellent job with it as well. I've really been enjoying it.
Yeah, I think it's the case with literature, like the act of like going through literature is like you read and listen to what interpretations are in there. It's the reason why Shakespearean professors and stuff like that can still be having different interpretations after it's been like hundreds of years. Is because like as you read it, you write compelling cases of like what might be present in here, and Madelyn Miller not only fully understands that with her background in literature and like being a professor and stuff, but she invites everybody who reads her books to do that same thing of like maybe imagine a story you thought you knew in a different perspective.
Yeah, totally. That's something that's been really cool about it is like sort of the shifting of perspective, like because like you mentioned, this book had been traditionally viewed as sort of like this amazing love story, and I think it's really cool to step out of just sort of like what it's traditionally been viewed as and be like, wait, this doesn't really sound like love. This kind of sounds like a weird relationship that people sort of glorified for such a long time. So do you want to jump into like first thoughts on the book?
Yeah, before we get there, just as a disclaimer, Madelyn Miller does like this awesome thing where she's showing a lot from the perspective of the statue, which has never been a perspective ever voiced. And so a lot of this has to do with a woman's perspective of like her interacting in the case of Madelyn's story of an abuser. And just want to get out front and say like neither Tim or myself know or fully understand like a woman's perspective. We're both cis men, but this is a story and we're just giving our thoughts on it. But again, like there's probably things that we'll miss and not know. So just putting that out as a disclaimer before we jump. Yeah, so jumping into it, the story, as we were talking about, is taken from the perspective of Galatea, who is the statue who has life breathed into her, and it starts with her in like a mental hospital, and over the course of the story we'll hear about like how her husband has checked her in because she essentially is not acting like the compliant, essentially like he only wants her for her beauty and for sex and stuff, and the minute she starts to deviate and have a personality, he checks her into a hospital and tears her away from their daughter. And so the story starts with her in a hospital, and we'll progressively talk through like what that experience is, what her experience of coming to life was, talk a little bit about her relationship with her daughter, and end with her trying to flee the hospital. So that's an overview of it. My first thoughts of it, the minute Madelyn Miller started like narrating this, it was like, whoa, this is so good. There's so much in there, like the voice of Galatea is so strong and so clever. She is like a woman in a situation with absolutely no power, and yet like in every moment she has not lost herself in it. Like she's being medicated to not resist or escape. She's being imprisoned. She is in this relationship where she has no power, and yet like throughout all of it, she does such a good job of like remembering who she is. How about you? What did your first thoughts?
Yeah, similar to you, I think it's really this incredible story that is like about empowering people and also sort of challenging the belief that like the perfect woman is a person who doesn't speak and doesn't like talk back and just like is available for, you know, sex or something. Like something that I will say I really enjoyed about it is that it's short. I'm not like a big reader of books, and maybe that sounds terrible saying like I'm glad that was short, but I feel like it's incredible how much Madelyn Miller really packed into just like the audiobook is like 45 minutes. It's like incredibly dense and it really takes you in a lot of directions. But I think it's beautifully written, and honestly, like I feel like it's maybe one of the best representations I've seen of like this subject matter tackled. So yeah, I really enjoyed it.
And I think that comes back to it, like with literature, there's like a ton of different ways to write and like different goals when you're writing. I think it's incredibly hard to make something that like is packed with like intense and like thought-provoking subject matter and is also easily digestible. And to do that in a short form is like, it just adds another layer to it. Like I'm a big fan of Dostoevsky. I think his work is really good, but there's sometimes when you're reading one of his books where you're like, this is a several hundred-page book, and did it need to be this big, or did you need to reiterate the point that many times? And to see Madelyn Miller like condensing it down and making it so good and tight is like just impressive.
Yeah, it's quite concise, and I really appreciate that about it.
The canon of literature is oftentimes a lot of the classical canon of literature is written by men, and so you read these women who don't sound like any woman you would know in real life. Like they don't have like fleshed out motivations, they don't have thoughts. They're oftentimes like seen as complaining and not seen as like a fully realized individual who's contributing to a lot of things. But like I think it's so good when we first open up, because you're like trying to get a feel for like what's happening and what's her situation, and the more you start to put the pieces together, you're like, wait, so she's in a hospital where she can't escape, they're drugging her, and the only time she has mental clarity is when her husband's coming, and when he comes, she has to play this role over and over again that mirrors the moment where she had life breathed into her, where like she has to pretend like she's just come to life, and then he like ultimately ends up like having sex with her, and like she's always pandering to him, and like through all of this you start to put the pieces together. You're like, oh man, she's having to deal with not only like an intense abuser, but like an entire society that is empowering and assisting this abuser to like take advantage of her.
Yeah, it's crazy like seeing her interactions with the doctor and the nurse as well, and they are fully playing into like that Galatea is like a crazy one, but like what her husband doing is totally normal, which plays into like what how our society traditionally has viewed women versus men.
Yeah, it made me think of two sort of examples with it. Like one being on the side of the hospitals and stuff, there's Dorothea Dix is like this very famous like American advocate for mental health, but in some of her uncovering for like creating mental health institutes, there was some individuals who were suffering from really intense mental health, but she also came across like some details where there was like women who like would be totally fine, and their husbands for one reason or another would put them into mental hospitals, whether that be things like a husband trying to get at the inheritance of a wife, or whether it be like a husband who just got annoyed or displeased with his wife and wanted to marry someone else, and so he like would check his wife into a mental hospital and then go about marrying someone else. And so like it mirrors those like traditions and things that are found as like in American history that is like shameful and bad. And she's mirroring that, but there's also this element about it that reminded me. Alistair Walker is this incredible writer who wrote this piece called Our Mother's Gardens, where she talks about like African American women who may have come from slave plantations and have dealt with like rape and abuse, and like how a lot of the literature at that time only portrayed them as like victims. But she talks about like if you look at these mothers who took in incredible abuse and trauma and then like started building like these gardens, she's like, you can see that like the ways in which they lived their lives, they were still humans that had creativity, that had like these other aspects to them other than their victimhood. And Galatea represents that too. Like she's in this incredibly like oppressive situation, and yet like she has these like very keen instincts about the people around her. Like she observes like, oh, the nurse is in a relationship with the doctor, and like she'll do these things because I know what that is to be human. Or like she'll have these insights as a mother, or like all these keen observations that show like she is more than a victim. She is like also a person who gets to control and her own destiny, even in this insane sort of system.
The original story where Pygmalion creates this statue and falls in love with it is like meant to depict the ideal perfect woman, which is one who is just attractive and doesn't talk and, you know, freely gives sex all the time. But I'd argue that like the depiction of Galatea in this book is I feel like Madelyn Miller trying to depict what a real perfect woman looks like, which is she thinks freely, she's smart, she cares deeply about those around her, as you see with the way she treats her daughter. And so it's really like, I think it's cool that Madelyn Miller is taking like this traditional view of what a woman should look like and turning it on its head. So I think that's really cool that she got through the book.
And like to that effect, like even she flips a couple of things on its head. Like not only is she talking about all these qualities, but even the things Galatea appreciates. Like she has like these stretch marks on her from having given birth and stuff, and like she celebrates these like marks and changes in her body that like signify like the passage of life and like these important moments. And it's like that's the things that her husband wants to like erase from her. He wants to like he even says, he's like, oh, if you were still a stone, I would chisel those off you, because they take away your image of perfection. But like from Galatea, she's like, no, this is what I love. This shows who I am and the markers of like what I've endured and had to process.
Yeah, and it's so cool that in the face of like such hardship and abuse that she faces, she's able to like maintain that sense of self and who she is and the way that she thinks, which is really cool.
Yeah, I think I just kept coming back to that, like, as the story progresses, like, you only just have a deeper respect for, like, she holds this sense of self throughout all of it and never at any point gives in. Like, at every stage, she's, like, evaluating her situation and, like, being like, what is the point of my existence, and, like, what can I, take from this? And so, like, in the story, she talks a little bit about, like, when she has her daughter and she has this relationship with her daughter, it's like the most important thing in her life and so worth having that she can endure the system of abuse if she gets to spend time with her daughter. And you see her even in her system of abuse, like finding ways for her daughter to be tutored and educated, and like going out and like having her daughter teach her how to read and stuff. So I'm curious, like, what were your thoughts about that and her relationships with her daughter?
I think it's amazing that not only is she able to like endure what she goes through with Pygmalion, but then you can see her deep love for her daughter. There's like one scene where she goes home and she notices her husband making a statue of a 10-year-old girl, which in the book you know that their daughter is 10 years old as well. And you see that Galatea doesn't want her husband to project his perfect vision of what a daughter should look like anymore, and so she rebels against that, and she shows that she wants her daughter to have a better future than she currently has with her husband, and so she's trying to break that chain, which I think is really incredible.
And you're totally right on that. Like you see it so played out in like the ways that she has to navigate all of these systems. Like the way she talks to her husband, she's always pandering. She's always like, "You're so perfect." She like erases her personality. But if you see the daughter, she is so forthright and direct and like willing to challenge authority, and you can sort of see how like Galatea is like so proud of her and so proud of about like, oh, we're both in this system, but like Galatea sort of bears the like brunt of it and shields her daughter from like that same experience that she has to endure.
Yeah, she bears the brunt of it, but she also makes sure that like throughout the book that her daughter is able to be herself, and I feel like really the only time that she shows like rejection towards her husband is when it comes to her daughter, because she wants to make sure that the chain is broken and that like this type of behavior doesn't continue in the next generation, which like really shows what a hero, you know, Galatea really is.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about Galatea. We've talked a little bit about her relationship with her and her daughter. What did you think of Pygmalion? Specifically him as like an abuser and a father and an artist. In those lenses, what sort of do you think about him?
I think Pygmalion is definitely like sort of this representation of what sort of, and Madelyn Miller says this sort of in her like footnotes at the end of the book, is like this depiction of like what incel culture is in modern day, which is sort of like these guys who have this perfect image of women in their minds, but like don't really allow them to have the autonomy to be a person in their own right.
And it's like super interesting, like he's sort of a pathetic excuse for an artist.
Yeah.
And like he's made his whole fortune because Galatea is so beautiful, and like whether or not he's the artist in it, like you just see so much about him where like he's so disconnected from reality. Like Galatea speaks to it where she's like, all of the women of the village, like there's nothing wrong with them, and yet like he's so obsessed with having not even really a woman, but like the image of a woman in his head, that like he's not willing to actually have a relationship with any of the women in his village, or even with Galatea. Like if she exhibits any character traits of like an actual person, he's like out. He's like, so like she's constantly forced to like erase all of who she is in front of him. And like not only that, like he's very like vindictive, he's very like passive aggressive and aggressive, and so there's like all these things that like as an abuser he's pretty pathetic, but like also as an artist, like it feels like he's very uninspired. Like it feels like what he wants is such a narrow focus.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was curious, as a person who's like dove into a lot of literature, how did you feel about like stylistically the way that was written, like also partially like with this cool merging of historical storytelling meshed with a modern cultural idea that's going on? What do you think about all that?
I think a lot about Madelyn Miller is pretty unique as a writer because she has like this deep background in classics and classical literature, specifically like Greek classics. Like I think I was watching an interview where she was saying like not only has she been reading sort of Greek myths for all her life, but like that she learned Latin and then actually learned how to read and write in Greek so that she could actually read some of the Greek myths in their original text. So because she has to like deep understanding of it, I tend to think what makes her literature so different is like there's a lot of like myth copycats, but they don't oftentimes sound like the original myths. They don't have the same sort of tone and tenor. And I think she has like locked in where like when you read it and listen to it, it feels like so similar to like what you would remember from like the Iliad or the Odyssey. And I think that's like on its own would have been an incredible skill. But the fact that she mixes in so many other pieces, I think that like also makes it so incredible. I have read almost every one of her works and tend to just find that like it's all good.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be my long answer to it. What did you think though?
Yeah, I feel like I really enjoy that aspect of it too, because I've been lately like reading the Odyssey, and so you can really tell where a lot of like the inspiration comes from in terms of like the way that she tells stories and the way that she like depicts things and creates the imagery in the storytelling. But it also really, like we've discussed before, has this modern twist to it, which I think is like makes it all the more interesting. So I really appreciated her style. And then I guess my next question is, what did you think of the ending of the book, where at the end of the book, Galatea walks out into the ocean, and then her husband Pygmalion follows her, and she traps him in and drowns both of them together. What did you think of that? Were you disappointed by it? Do you feel like it was a good way to wrap things up? How did you feel?
I kind of felt to me like another moment where she's constantly exploring her options, and in the first parts of her existence, she's thinking about like how can she eke out like pieces for herself, but as her daughter comes into the picture, she's constantly thinking about like how can I protect and move my daughter forward, and like over the course of the book and in her thoughts, it like her husband's just like the worst.
Yeah.
And so like she like her first step is to go and see if she can actually like break out her daughter and then both get away, but when that's not a possibility, she's like, okay, if I can't get us both out, I can at least make it such that she doesn't have this like oppressive figure dominating her life, trying to mold her into the image of a woman rather than an actual woman. So like I was sad to see her go because she's an awesome character, but it was cool to see her like reclaim also another moment and to be like, okay, like if I'm gonna have to go out and I can't be free, I can also make sure that my daughter doesn't have to suffer with this crazy influence in her life.
And I feel like it is very fitting for like Greek mythology. It felt like it was par for the course in terms of like this dramatic ending, which was cool even in like this modern retelling of the story, and just like truly inspirational that like she like breaks the chains so that her daughter can have a better life in the future. So I thought that was like a really great way to wrap it up, although very tragic.
We sort of talked through the elements and stuff and walked through some of the story. I think we're probably coming to the end here. If you had to rank it, what would you rank it?
I really enjoyed the book. Again, like I think the storytelling is amazing. The style in which he writes it is great. The themes that they discuss are very deep and moving. And I also obviously love that it's a short book. I honestly would give it like a 9 out of 10. It was like an incredible read. What about you?
Yeah, I think it's either a 9 or a 10. I'm coming to realize like I'm just like anything Madelyn Miller writes, I'm just like such a sucker for her. So I say that knowing that I have like a pretty clear bias, but I just think it's really tight. It's really concise and it like reads really well. So I would probably also give it a 10 and highly recommend it to others, just because like I think it's easy to get through and there's a lot of good content in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would recommend it to everybody, to be honest. It's a great book that I think honestly everybody should read.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. If you liked what we did today, please like, subscribe, follow, and I guess we'll see you next time.
See you next time.